Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us here for our masterclass on NIST Digital Identity Guidelines, SP 863 Draft Revision 4. The introduction really rolls right off the tongue. My name is Ryan Galluzzo. I'm the Identity Program Lead for NIST's Applied Cybersecurity Division. That means I spend the vast majority of my time attempting to kind of coordinate across a disparate group of projects, but one of the main projects that I work on and help co-author are the Digital Identity Guidelines, and I'm joined today by my colleague Andy.
Hi, I'm Andy Regenscheid. I am the project lead for Applied Cryptography at NIST, where I focus on really just applications where cryptography can be used as a fundamental tool for making systems more secure. In this regard, I focus both as the technical lead for our standards work on the personal identity verification project, as well as working with Ryan on our digital identity guidelines.
And the primary lead for the Digital Identity Guidelines, David Temashuk, couldn't be here to make it today, unfortunately, but he's also one of the key contributors and key developers of the work we do here, so I wanted to make sure we gave him a quick shout out. So really quick before we dive into this, in order to help level set a little bit as well too, how many people in here are actually familiar with the Digital Identity Guidelines in NIST Special Publication 863? Fantastic. That's actually a really good number. And how many people have read the draft of Revision 4 that we put out last year? Okay, that's not quite as many. And how many of you have picked out and memorized your favorite line item that bothers you the most about 63 and plan to ask us about it in the Q&A session? Hands up? Nobody? All right. Whoever's doing mics, please avoid those folks at the end. So the digital, and that's a joke. We will answer whatever questions we can at the end of the presentation. We'll also be available afterwards if you want to ask us some questions about where we're going, what we're doing. Hopefully some of this is new. A lot of this is probably going to be a little bit repetitive for some folks who have been part of these conversations in the past. But we did want to make sure we level set. So what are the Digital Identity Guidelines? Well, it's essentially a set of documents that help provide the process and technical requirements for how the government does identity. We've broken it down into 4 volumes. And this is something that was actually done in the previous revision, 863 Revision 3. And it took what had previously been a very broad, very singular document that covered all the topics together and broke them out into a bit more detail into four different volumes. So we've got the base volume, which is where we have our digital identity model and a lot of the terms and concepts that help set the scene for all the other documents that follow. It's also where we include our risk management process. So this is the information and the guidance that we provide to agencies and organizations as they attempt to make key decisions about what assurance levels to implement, what controls to put in place, and how to balance the varying kind of components that push and pull on identity. Our Volume A is where we contain our identity proofing and enrollment, covering everything from the resolution process to the validation of identity evidence and attributes to verification and connection of those attributes to an individual. This is where we have essentially your journey from an unknown user to a known user. 63B covers our authentication and lifecycle management, really looking at things as simple as multi-factor authentication, but as complicated as how do you actually do multi-factor authentication? What are the acceptable combinations of authenticator types to help achieve different assurance levels, and how do we manage credentials and authenticators over a life cycle? Finally, we have 863C, which is our federation and assertion section. This covers how do you actually convey identity data to trusted parties that are either internal or external to your organization and allow for an identity to be used or leveraged in multiple different locations and different security realms. One of the main things to kind of point out here is there's a lot of folks who consider 863 or a mistaken belief that 863 is really focused on just public-facing use cases. That's not the case. It's intended to be a baseline document that can support a broad range of use cases, going from enterprise to public-facing, from internal to external. And it really serves as kind of the starting point for, as kind of Andy was indicating, a lot of our personal identity verification documentation within the federal government. So a lot of those are almost kind of profiles of what we put into these volumes within 863. So the last major revision we did of 63 was in 2017. In 2020, we kicked off the revision process for 863 in an effort to begin getting input and feedback from the broader community, the broader audience, as to how are we going to go ahead and handle and deal with, updates to 863. How are we going to update the digital identity guidelines to maintain pace with the changing world? Contrary to popular belief, we actually did not start this process as a result of the pandemic. However, we took what we got from the 2020 call for comments. We took a lot of lessons learned from engagement with state, local, federal, and commercial entities that they experienced during the pandemic as they attempted to take a lot of on-premise type, hard stand type processes, physical processes, and rapidly convert them to digital. It really was kind of a stress and test on the identity infrastructure like we hadn't really ever experienced. So we wanted to make sure as we went through this process, not only did we take into account what we heard in 2020, but we started to take into account what we learned from our conversations and our engagement with a lot of organizations that had to deal with tremendous challenges during the pandemic. And we took these and distilled them down into a few core concepts. We call them our kind of design principles for how we wanted to make changes and updates to 863 as a volume, and these are all kind of inculcated into revision 4. Hopefully a lot of you have seen these before, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them so we can get to a few other topics, but we did want to really emphasize a few of them on here, in particular advancing equity. So this has been a very hot topic. Obviously, we've heard some conversations and discussions here today, here at Identiverse around this concept, but really, how do we make our identity solutions as inclusive and equitable as possible? Our goal here is not perfection, right? We understand that there are still going to be issues and challenges with how your identity systems perform with certain groups. Our goal here is to help agencies and organizations put in place the processes to be able to evaluate, understand, identify, and remediate issues related to equity and inclusivity in a way that is consistent and can be done iteratively. Again, not perfection, but continuous improvement over time. Wanted to emphasize optionality within all of our volumes, so making sure we're creating as many possible pathways to successful outcomes as we can without potentially compromising security. So looking at ways that we can add additional channels, additional evidence, additional assurance levels, anything that we could do to help create greater options both for the end user and for organizations to bring to the end users. Deter phishing, fraud, and advanced threat. This is kind of just table stakes, right? We need to continue to make pace with the changes within the threat environment, make sure we're addressing critical changes to how attackers are going after identity systems. And one of the things in particular on here is phishing. Andy will talk about that in a little bit, the actual definition of phishing resistance. We also want to look at how fraud was evolving and add new controls to address things like automated enrollment attacks, social engineering going after identity proofing controls, things like that. So we really wanted to make sure we attempted to address those to the greatest degree possible. Wanted to address lessons learned through real-world implementations. Guidance has been out since 2017. People have attempted to implement it. There are definitely places where the words and the code, when implemented, don't exactly match up the way you want them to. So we wanted to make sure we learned as much as we could about where those issues existed and do our best to update and improve the guidance to address those. I want to emphasize multidisciplinary risk management processes. This is at a slightly different level than some of these other ones, but this is another thing that we learned pretty substantially from the pandemic. Being able to have a pathway for information to pass from your fraud teams, your usability teams, your security teams, through to your identity proofing and identity and authentication solutions to be able to make sure they're actually capturing and performing and doing things in the manner in which you intend them to do. Your identity solutions are not stopping fraud. You need to make sure there are pathways to address that fraud with your identity system, ideally. And finally, we wanted to clarify and consolidate requirements. It's 4 volumes. It is a ton of words. There are places where we aren't as consistent as we'd like to be. So we want to make sure wherever possible we can improve the structure, improve the language, and make it as consistent as possible to make implementation as easy as possible. So what are the major changes? And again, a masterclass in 50 minutes on a 4-volume set of documents is not easy. So we're going to give you a quick high level on a few of these and then dive into a couple of them in a little bit more detail to help provide some awareness of some of the things we're changing, and also to give a quick overview of some of the things we're starting to see major comments on. So one of the main things we did was revamping our risk management and assurance selection process. We have pretty much redone the whole thing. I will get into that in a little bit more detail in the next couple slides, but it's one of the most substantial changes that we made. We've introduced the concept of digital evidence. This is kind of our pathway for attempting to open the door to new and emerging technologies like mobile driver's license, verifiable credentials, other new kinds of technology that can help complete the identity proofing process and also put us in a position that as they continue to evolve and mature, we know better how we can actually integrate them going forward. But we needed to make sure we kind of cracked that door, opened it, and let those into this conversation to make sure that we had a pathway for adoption as things went forward. We've mandated the concept of a trusted referee, and we've recommended the concept of an applicant reference. These are very lingo-y. We're going to talk a little bit about them in the future, but basically these are two pathways to help people through identity proofing processes that otherwise might not be able to complete them. We've updated our biometric performance requirements, and actually more importantly than I think than the biometric performance requirements, the biometric requirements period. So what we really wanted to do, particularly in the identity proofing section, was make sure we had performance expectations that met with the context of identity proofing. In the previous revision, we kind of referenced the authentication, false match rate and false non-match rate. We want to make sure that those things are actually taken into the context of identity proofing, and then also make sure we have very clear requirements for how you gain consent around the use of biometrics, your retention, your deletion, and all the things that kind of go into making sure individuals truly understand why they're sacrificing their biometric and what it's going to result in for them and how it can be managed. Wanted to make sure we define phishing resistance. Again, Andrew will talk much more about that in a few minutes, but we really wanted to follow through and make sure that we were addressing what we were seeing as a pretty substantial set of attacks that were going on in the space, and make sure we had technical controls and requirements that could be applied to really define what phishing resistance was. We've changed our password requirements. I'm not getting into these too much, but bottom line is we had previously recommended against composition and rotation. Now we're just saying don't do it. We've established a new identity assurance level. So it's actually not totally accurate. We've kind of reframed an identity assurance level. So we've always had IAL1, which used to be no identity proofing self-asserted attributes. That is now an actual identity assurance level that has specific controls, and in particular, it allows for optional use of biometrics for remote processes. One of the areas that we're also focused there as well too is making sure that the verification, is a bit more consistent with a lower level of risk than going through what you would do at IAL2. And finally, we've provided normative language for vendors and agencies to continually assess and evaluate the inclusivity and the accessibility of their solutions and the equity of their solutions to make sure that over time there are not issues that are coming up. And again, focus here is on iterative improvement, not perfection, making sure you can actually identify those issues and take some action to improve on them over time. Again, we're not going to be able to get into detail on all of those things that changed and so many others that have changed. And I'm sure everyone here, again, has a favorite. Please feel free to bring it up when we get to the Q&A session. But we are going to focus on our risk management and assurance selection because it was such a substantial change from the previous version. We're going to focus on trusted referee and applicant references because we have received a large volume of comments that indicate there's either some confusion or some challenges around what those concepts are to help clarify that as well too. We're going to talk about phishing resistance because, passkeys are all the rage at the moment. We want to make sure we get out some of the context and conversation we've been having around phishing resistance. And then finally, Andy's also going to cover what are we doing next, what's coming down the road, and what concepts are we going to address as we go. So risk management and assurance level selection. We actually had animations in here at one point, but they seem to have disappeared. So there was going to be a cool iterative reveal here, but there's not. What we wanted to do was really take the process that we had laid out in 63.3 and make it a bit simpler and make it a bit more focused on compliance. Whether it was more of an interpretation or reality, a lot of people saw what we had in there to begin with as something that was a bit too rigid and a bit too structured and focused on achieving specific assurance level outcomes. So we wanted to take that and we take a lesson from our RMF, our risk management framework colleagues at NIST, and abstract it to more of a process-oriented approach and focus as well on documentation and documentation and documentation. So why are you making these decisions, making sure it's written down and making sure it's understood by everyone who understands that risk management process. And so we've laid out essentially a 4-step process. And step 3 in here, we did receive a lot of comments that this should be 2 separate processes, and we might do that in the future. But step 1 is really going in and conducting your impact assessment. And this is something that hasn't changed much from what was in 863 Revision 3. Still focuses on the idea of identifying your users, identifying those that are impacted by your application or maybe impacted by a failure of identity proofing, authentication, or federation. But it takes it to the next level in focusing on not just the kind of risks and harms that might befall your enterprise, but it also mandates that you really focus on what are the potential risks and issues that might befall your users. You can even take it further to specific communities or specific business partners, but at a minimum, we want you to be able to look at both your entity and your enterprise and what the risks are there, as well as what the issues might be to the end user. And also start to take into account things that aren't just security related. For example, what are the risks of us not providing service to this individual in a timely fashion? Right? Another thing that we kind of observed from the pandemic is when you're applying these kinds of controls to benefits, there are very serious consequences to not providing services. And so at the end of this, you're essentially able to go through and document what is my impact level. And these are very simple low, medium, and highs, but these allow for the initial mapping into what the assurance levels are. So you go from there with your impact assessment and your determination of what level you're at to your selecting an assurance level. And again, this has not changed very much from what was in the original 863.3, but the focus here is mapping your high, medium, low into whatever the assurance levels are that make most sense for the functions that you're offering: identity assurance, authentication assurance, federation assurance. And at the end, you will have a baseline assurance level. And this is something that changes the context a little bit from 863.3. This is a starting point. This is, for lack of a better term, a negotiation point where you're able to put in, here's what we think are based on core security controls, based on some of the risks we've identified, this is where we think we need to start. And now we move into step 3, which is the real kind of deviation from what we had in 863.3. And this is focused on a lot of feedback we got from agencies and organizations that felt that the assurance levels were too rigid and didn't take into account the ability for them to actually manage risk associated with their specific environment and their specific users. And this is the tailoring process. This is where you take your baseline and you actually evaluate what's going to be the impact of implementing these assurance levels on my users. So what's the impact of asking for multi-factor authentication, potentially asking for a biometric as part of the verification process? And how do we evaluate what those potential outcomes could be and make decisions about how we want to balance the risks associated with this? Now, this doesn't say that you have to move your assurance level down or you have to use compensating controls, but it is an effort to at least evaluate and understand the fact that your identity systems actually introduce additional considerations and risks that need to be considered when you make your final determinations of what controls you're going to deploy. And so with that, you're going to go through, you're going to select whatever your assurance levels are going to be in the final process, and you're going to go ahead and document those things. And again, we've received a lot of feedback that this should be 2 different steps: tailor, then document. That's pretty simple. We'll probably end up doing that. But we've also received a lot of feedback that this might cause issues or hamper interoperability. If everyone's tailoring their assurance levels to their own desires, to their own outcomes, then how are we going to be able to trust federated assertions that might be coming in with certain changes and certain modifications? And that's something we certainly understand, and we're still working through exactly how we want to handle that. The initial response that we kind of come back with is the goal of having these common communications and common documentation should be able to allow for federated engagements and trust agreements with organizations, because you can clearly see what risks have been accepted, what risks have been mitigated, and how they can be addressed either through compensating controls or supplemental controls. We do acknowledge that there can be challenges here. So some concepts that we're thinking through right now are whether there should be profiles for specific types of use cases that are accepted by a community, or whether we can come up with some additional templating that can go into the selection process. So still thinking through this, but the goal here is to give flexibility to organizations to address their actual user bases and the threats and risk environments that they operate in. And then finally, we've added the concept of continuous evaluation and improvement. And this is really something that a lot of agencies and organizations, I think, already do, but this is trying to document it and put it in place, the ability for you to have the defined metrics for how you want your system to perform. How well do you want to do from a pass rate? How much will you accept from, suspicious or fraudulent transactions that are coming through? How do you want to establish the process of collecting the information you need to be able to understand how well is my system performing? How well is my assurance levels operating for me at these levels? Do I need to make modifications to address a specific threat or a specific usability issue? This is how you kind of set in place that ability to integrate that information, and then hopefully as well to through an integrated program, you've got multidisciplinary folks that are part of this process who can help you understand not just what are the identity issues here, but how are those impacting your privacy, your usability, your accessibility, your equity, and your fraud. These are all key things that need to be integrated and constantly considered as you evaluate performance. So we've gone for this process-oriented approach. Again, there has been some feedback about concerns over interoperability and how this results in variances, but we are working towards trying to address that as well too through other mechanisms. But again, goal is to move away from compliance focus to something that's more operationally oriented and process-oriented and risk management oriented. Moving on to trusted referees and applicant references. Again, these are wonderful terms. If you've got better options for us, we are open to hearing them. But the idea here is that we've heard a lot of feedback that kind of conflates and confuses these two concepts. So we want to take a minute to kind of just talk through at a high level what these are and what they are not, and what we are starting to hear for feedback on these as well too. In general, they're both intended to provide greater pathways to success for users who typically can't work their way through an identity proofing process. The trusted referee does it as an agent of the CSP, so someone who kind of works on behalf of a credential service provider or potentially as a third party that supports your credential service provider. And their goal is to make risk-based decisions, to evaluate things like evidence, to do things like verification, to make decisions about attributes or validation processes, to make sure that this person is who they claim to be to the greatest degree possible. But they're supposed to be there for support of individuals who cannot otherwise get through a traditional identity proofing process. So someone who doesn't necessarily have traditional identity evidence, like a driver's license or a passport. Maybe they've got a few other different documents from a different country that need to be reviewed, something to that effect. And they're there to help make that decision and make a risk-based decision on behalf of the CSP. They're going to be known by the CSP. Odds are they're going to be an employee or a trusted third party. So while we do suggest, yes, they are identity proofed, that's going to be more probably part of your employee onboarding process than something else. We also want to point out that these can be done virtual, these can be done in person, these can be done asynchronously. So if you have to have manual review processes, all those can be part of this kind of trusted referee concept. But again, this is not just an attended identity proofing process. We want people to still be doing identity proofing processes that go through resolution, validation, and verification consistent with the requirements that we put out, as well as potentially modifications to those requirements based on your needs, but in a consistent way. This is more of a failover concept to address individuals who aren't necessarily able to get through the way they want to. The applicant reference, on the other hand, is really intended to be someone who can speak for that person or specific aspects of their identity. So we're really talking about vouching. We're talking about, I can speak to who you are. I can speak to specific attributes, where you live, perhaps, a work status that you might have. They can potentially speak to conditions around your identity. For example, yes, I am aware that, there's been an emergency and Ryan's not able to get back to his home. He doesn't have access to certain pieces of evidence, something to that effect. But they're there to help speak on your behalf in the proofing process and help you get through the proofing process. What they aren't there to do is act on your behalf in transactions after that identity proofing process. They are there to help you through identity proofing. We are not talking about power of attorney here, although a power of attorney document could be used to help associate an individual with an applicant reference, but we're not talking about giving them the right to work on your behalf once you're in the business application. We're really focused on someone that can help vouch for identity, vouch for attributes, and vouch for situations and circumstances, rather than someone who's going to operate on your behalf outside of that process. So those two things work together, hopefully, and in conjunction to be able to support additional pathways and additional options for individuals to actually get through an identity proofing process. So from a feedback perspective, we've actually got a lot of feedback that individuals and organizations like the concept. They have also told us quite unanimously we haven't gone far enough in the guidelines around this. So starting to think about what are the appropriate applications of trusted referee for validation, for verification, for resolution. How do we avoid things like collaboration on fraud? How do we avoid things where there's someone representing 20 people as an applicant reference and just getting paid to do it so they can get through the process? So what are some additional controls we can put in place, particularly things like on the applicant reference side, how can we actually identify documents and evidence that can support a relationship between that user and that applicant reference? So these are all things we're considering. We've gotten really good feedback on these, and we're starting to think about what we're going to do next on it. But again, general support for the concepts. We just need to go a little bit further, and I think in addressing some of these things. So I'm going to hand off to Andy, who's going to take us through our phishing resistance conversations.
Thanks, Ryan. So revision 4 really emphasizes the importance of strong phishing-resistant authentication. This is really motivated by the increase in sophistication and phishing attacks that we've seen. Right? Phishing attacks aren't just limited to being able to capture static authenticators like a password. The attacks that we see and the readily available tools that are out there are capable of also stealing, dynamic authenticators like one-time passwords and relaying them in real time to the victim website. So this, these attacks now really increase the importance of phishing resistance. That's certainly some multi-factor authentication is better than no multi-factor authentication. But really, this is what's driving us to really emphasize the importance of this today. And so, Revision 4 was intended to accommodate new forms of strong phishing-resistant authentication to both, to facilitate adoption and improve usability. So phishing resistance is both a common goal both now within the 863 framework as well as from federal government policy. Phishing resistance under the Rev 4 guidelines is required at AAL3 and recommended at AAL2. And the White House, through OMB Memo 2209, now requires agencies to give public users the option of using a phishing-resistant authentication method. This doesn't preclude them from also offering methods like, SMS one-time passwords, which, remain important for, being able to allow some people to do MFA. But it does mean that users that are able to choose and use phishing-resistant authentication will be able to. On the federal enterprise side, for federal employees and contractors, NIST's revisions that we're making now on our personal identity verification program will require phishing-resistant authentication for PIV credentials being used to access federal systems. So when we started the revision 4 process, we really saw a need to be able to accommodate these, some of the new technologies and new methods and maturing methods for doing phishing-resistant authentication. The earlier version, revision 3 of 863, provided for phishing resistance through a property known as verifier impersonation resistance. Sorry for that mouthful of a term. We're no longer using it in revision 4. But the way that phishing resistance then would work in revision 3 was a method that we called channel binding. Basically, the authentication process would be tightly and cryptographically bound to the communications channel between the user and the website that they're accessing. So typically, this would be binding it to the TLS session. Really, the main and perhaps only standards-based method for this type of channel binding is client-authenticated TLS, where the digital signature produced by the user or client is bound to the TLS session that's being negotiated. That way, if an attacker, even if an attacker were able to, say, capture that information, they wouldn't be able to use it. They wouldn't be able to relay it to a target website. Like, it would be clear that that was being replayed over a different session. So client-auth TLS has very strong security properties, but it can also be a challenge to deploy for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that it requires issuing PKI certificates to your users. So within revision 4, certainly this is going to remain an option, and I think enterprises will still continue to use things like client-auth TLS and PKI in some use cases, but we did still see a need then for, what are other options that could work, particularly for, say, public users that have different notions of scale. And in this regard, we've seen a lot of progress over the last, say, 5 or 10 years with the maturation of technologies like FIDO and WebAuthn. So those technologies is what motivated the inclusion of another method now for phishing resistance that we've called verifier name binding. In this case, it's binding the authentication process and the authentication information to the domain name that's being accessed. So this is ultimately what things like WebAuthn and FIDO use. The key point is that phishing attacks, usually a phishing attack website cannot hijack a domain or get a valid PKI certificate. So what they do is, they'll stand up a lookalike website and trick users. By binding, say, the authentication process to the domain name, things like WebAuthn and FIDO use, domain-specific public key credentials and use a domain name in the assertions that are generated. That way, phishing attacks wouldn't even be able to get the information that they would need to target a user in a website in a phishing attack. Really, I think we're in a much better place today than at any point before at being able to accommodate large-scale, scalable phishing-resistant authentication. Whether it means using smart cards and PKI authenticators to do client auth TLS, or making use of technologies like FIDO and security keys or platform authenticators. I think there's many more options available today for both enterprise users and public users to achieve phishing resistance. So where are we at today? As Ryan said, we released revision 4 for public comment back in January. It was ultimately out for about a 120-day comment period ending in April. I know not all of you have seen the draft yet, but I know many of your organizations have because we've received a tremendous amount of feedback on the draft. We got comments from over 130 organizations and individuals collectively sending in over 3,400 comments. In my 17 years at NIST, this is really the most feedback that I've seen on a document suite that I've worked on personally. And we got feedback across all 4 major volumes, but perhaps unsurprisingly, identity proofing in volume A was perhaps the favorite topic. If you didn't have a chance to review and send in feedback yet, don't worry. This is a process. Certainly the public comment period is a very important part of our process, but there will be additional opportunities to provide feedback and to stay engaged. One of the things that I thought was very interesting about the feedback that we got was the makeup of who sent in comments. As many of you know, NIST is non-regulatory. Our statutory authority is limited to, for our guidelines, is limited to federal systems, specifically non-national security. Nonetheless, the majority, or bulk of the comments that came in came from private sector entities. We heard from advocacy groups stressing the importance of privacy and equity. We heard from technology providers for critical identity services or foundational technology platforms that we use. We heard from the manufacturing and security sectors. And being in Las Vegas, I'll add that we even heard from the gaming and gambling sector on these guidelines. And in many cases, these organizations care because they do business with the government, either as a provider or as a business partner. But in many cases, too, there's organizations that submitted comments because they've chosen to voluntarily adopt these guidelines, and they're interested in seeing that their needs are met in this revision as well. So what have you been hearing? Honestly, we are still going through that big set of 3,400 comments right now. It is going to take us a while, but we've had a chance now to look through the comments and see some of the common themes that have emerged. And Ryan touched on some of these, like the comments that came in on trusted referee or the tailoring process. In addition to that, we've gotten a lot of feedback on digital evidence. I think everybody sees the potential value that these new and emerging forms of digital evidence have at improving both the security and usability of the remote identity proofing process. And in particular, we've gotten a lot of comments and questions asking about how specifically MDLs and verifiable credentials can fit into both the proofing process and perhaps even the authentication process in 63B. And this is certainly something that we're very interested in as well because of the strong potential. Related to this, we've also gotten feedback to expand the digital identity model to account for new entities, things like attribute providers and attribute issuers that have always been really a critical part of that model, but are becoming even more important as we move to a world with verifiable credentials. We also got a lot of feedback on fraud requirements. Risk analytics and risk scoring, we've alluded to that and discussed that in 863, but in the context of additional controls that an organization could choose to implement. Neither Rev 3 nor the draft Rev 4 really included much in the way of normative requirements for what to include as fraud prevention controls. So these comments, in many cases, were asking us for additional guidance and requirements for what fraud mitigation programs could include, as well as potential baseline requirements for fraud checks that could occur. In addition, we've gotten feedback on how the assurance levels are described in the base volume, looking for more information on how to select an appropriate assurance level. One of the suggestions that came in is more closely tying the attacks and threats that are mitigated at each assurance level within the descriptions. And on authentication, if you've been paying attention to the agenda at Identiverse, I think it's of little surprise that many of the comments that came in on 63B were related to passkeys and syncable credentials in general. And this has been, I think, a really interesting topic, because historically, our guidance on particularly cryptographic authenticators have always assumed that the key would be unique and bound to a single device. And as we look at these new models of allowing, say, individuals to sync their credentials across different devices that they own, or even share those credentials with a different user, certainly that's going to introduce some new risks. But at the same time, we certainly see the value that these new and emerging methods have at improving access and improving ease of use for strong phishing-resistant authentication. And I think it's going to be important tools to use as agencies and other organizations look to deploy phishing resistance at the AAL2 level. So the comments that came in were largely, well, I should say that within the draft revision that went out, we made some initial changes to accommodate syncable authenticators. But of course, we've gotten some feedback on areas where we need to go into clarify requirements or go into more detail. And ultimately, I expect a lot of this will likely take the form of additional guidance that we can give organizations that are considering the use of these syncable authenticators within their environment, whether it's for their enterprise use cases or their public-facing use cases. So what's next? This one didn't actually appear. So we are today now are largely focused on getting through those 3,400 comments that have come in. As we do that, this summer we plan to hold a workshop where we'll be able to go into more detail about some of the big ticket items that have come up in the comments, let people know what our current thinking is on how we'll deal with those, as well as start to hear from the community about where they'd like us to go in those areas. What we'd like to do is get to a point in the fall where we're able to make a decision on what is the finalization path for these documents. Namely, do we know enough right now to go to final versions of the 63-4 document suite, or are we going to want to release revised drafts of one or more of those volumes for an additional round of public comment? In the meantime, what can you do to stay involved? First of all, 863 and the digital identity guidelines is not the only thing that we do on digital identity at NIST. Just last month, we released a draft roadmap that documents really across the board what NIST is doing on digital identity, including our work on PIV, biometrics, access control, and mobile driver's license. So that draft roadmap is out for public comment now through June 16th. You can also stay engaged with us through the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, the NCCOE. For those of you who don't know the NCCOE, you can think of this as, say, a security integration lab where NIST brings in vendors and their vendors' products and shows how to integrate their products and services to solve real-world business needs. And in particular, we have a new project standing up right now at the NCCOE with the aim of accelerating adoption of mobile driver's license. So whether you're a technology provider that may be able to work on using or creating or validating mobile driver's licenses, or simply someone interested in being able to adopt and use MDLs, there's multiple pathways for you to participate at the NCCOE. You can also stay engaged through our workshops. Like I said, this summer we're planning on having another workshop on 863, like we had back in January. By the way, if you weren't able to join the webinar that we had back in January, we went through in greater detail than we were able to do today the changes that we made across all 4 volumes. So if you find yourself with about 4 hours of spare time, you can go online and find a recording of that session and listen to me and Ryan and some of our colleagues talk more about the 63 revision. And if those more formal engagement methods don't necessarily work for you, informal reach outs to us also work. Our email addresses are always open, either reaching out to us directly or sending the comments to digcomments@nist.gov. We're always happy to talk about, say, any questions you have on our guidelines, or any unique challenges or technologies that you think are relevant. So thanks for hanging in there with us. I don't know how much time we have left, but I think we're happy to take questions as long as we can.
What people didn't know is the slide that had the next steps actually had all the dates that all this is going to be done.
Yes.
Apparently, since the slides fell apart, I know. The first question will be done. The mic is dead.
Oh.
You want to mention when your roadmap session is?
Yeah. So, if there's a way to get or relay questions, we'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, we can repeat them too.
We have
Shout
about
them
15
out.
minutes, so yeah, shout it out.
It's more about the engagement. What do you guys think of this?
So the question was what we think of at NIST about potentially using something like Discord as part of the engagement process. We've not thought about Discord specifically, but we're always open to additional ideas. I think one of the things we've kicked around is, we've used Slack before. We used GitHub in Rev 3 very extensively for open comments and kind of crowdsourcing of things, but we're always open to new ideas. We do have some restrictions based upon information security rules at NIST, but for the most part, if it's public facing, there's some options that we could potentially leverage. So we're open to thoughts. We're also open to ideas if folks have it on how we can kind of keep the process rolling in the future of updates and make it a bit more, we'll say, agile, rather than waiting 7 or 5 years. Go ahead. Okay.
Specific biometric authenticators listed that say this voice, this lands in this assurance level?
So the question was, do we have specific biometric modalities grouped into assurance levels? Andy, I don't know if you want to take that, but I think the general answer is we don't focus on the modality so much as the...
Right. Our guidelines on biometrics are really focused on the performance characteristics as opposed to the modalities themselves. So as long as the modality can meet those performance metrics, it could be used. Yeah.
Plans for evaluating strength of origin name binding outside of WebAuthn or phishing resistance?
Strength of what kind of binding?
Just origin name, verifier
Oh.
name binding.
Yeah, well, so this has come up. So the question was, are there thoughts around other methods or paths for the verifier name binding besides just binding to things like domain names? That's come up. I think a challenge with that path is that for that to be phishing resistance and prevent relays, the client has to be able to validate something about who they're talking to. So with the domain name, the browser largely knows what domain name they're accessing and can sort of validate that that's passed, that's bound to the authentication information. So, I mean, I'm certainly very interested in other, other paths there that aren't domain name specific.
I'm not thinking about different paths. Stick with domain name binding.
Okay.
But different methodologies for domain name binding other than WebAuthn.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and the way he was saying other ways to do binding, just things like domain names, other than just WebAuthn. The way that the draft talks about verifier name binding is intended to be kind of agnostic to the specific protocol that's used. So certainly motivated by things like WebAuthn, but it's not exclusive to that.
How do we evaluate what I'm
Yeah.
Do you have any programs planned for helping industry evaluate strength of that claim?
Yeah. Well, no plans right now, but I mean, I think that could be an that could be an interesting thing for us to look at as we, consider doing updates to things like the, the implementation resources that we have with 63.
Time for one more question.
Do you have any thoughts around like business identity assurance levels? Is that something that y'all run into?
So we've not thought of it from the perspective of business assurance levels. We've certainly had a lot of conversations about the fact that we do, at some point in time, someone's going to need to address the actual processes for verifying an entity. We don't address it now. I don't know that we'll address it in revision 4, but we are certainly open to different pathways for figuring out where that fits into guidance in the future. Again, whether that's in 863 or something else or some kind of NIST IR, we're certainly open to it, and we certainly know it's a gap that needs to be filled. Do we have time for one more? I know there was one more question over here. Can we stretch because we were a little late? Okay.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the IAL2 level of assurance without biometrics and what you're seeing for suggestions. Like, what are people? It seemed like you kind of were fishing there.
Yeah.
I wondered what you caught.
So the question was whether we got any substantial feedback on IAL2 processes that would not use biometrics. I'm assuming you're thinking more from the remote perspective than in person. We're still going through. I would say we've certainly gotten a lot of comments that have ranged from everywhere to no, you should not eliminate the use of biometrics in IL2 remote workflows, all the way to, there's other technologies that could be applied. I would say we haven't yet found anything that is incredibly concrete as far as potential kind of options there, but we're still exploring it. We still have a lot of comments to work through, and we're still open to ideas. So if there's thoughts or processes that you're thinking about, we're looking, we're certainly open to them. I would say, the things that we've heard most about are things like risk scoring technologies and fraud analytics tools. The one challenge we've got there is how do we provide things that can be standardized at this point, because of the fact that a lot of those technologies are proprietary. And that's not to say they don't bring a lot of value to process, but how can we help an agency and organization pick the right product rather than just a product that generally does something. So not in any way, shape, or form things we've ruled out, but just the challenge of trying to figure out exactly how we could potentially mitigate and integrate those into what we've got as guidance. Anything else, or we got to go? I don't know. We're getting kicked off. If you want to talk with us, we'll just hang out outside and you can hunt us down.